Everybody, welcome to this evening's program, Museums as Agents of Change, which is a partnership between the soon-to-be-built Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Jewish Museum of Maryland in Baltimore. I am Kara Blond. I'm the director of the Capitol Jewish Museum, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. This is the very last program of our jam-packed week of groundbreaking festival events as we get started building a Jewish museum for the nation's capital. We turned over the first dirt on Monday just a few days ago, and we plan to open our doors in the spring of 2022. Our museum is going to have an experimental spirit that invites our visitors to connect across families and diverse communities, reflect on the relevance of the past to today, and act on behalf of their values and their communities. So check out our website, capitoljewishmuseum.org, for more programming and to follow along with us on this absolutely crazy museum building journey that we're on. Tonight, we are thrilled to be working alongside JMM and taking on a really important topic that we've been wrestling with a lot as we imagine and plan the new museum. Over the past several years, and particularly over the last few months, our country has been grappling with systemic racial injustice in our country and how we can change long-standing structures and policies and assumptions that chronically disadvantage groups of people based not on what they do, but on who they are. And museums have also been working to redefine our role in this national reckoning. There's actually been quite a brouhaha among the international museum community about how to define what makes a museum. Are museums just custodians of collections and research and audience engagement, or are they also active partners with the community and contributing to dignity and justice and equality? And as institutions that are consistently viewed as trustworthy and accurate, but frankly whose origins are really steeped in colonialism and elitism, we have both a really important platform, but we also have a lot of work to do. So for my museum and for our colleagues at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, we feel like we bear an added layer of responsibility. We both serve predominantly white constituents in predominantly non-white cities. And although the Jewish communities in Maryland and the district are also predominantly white, they are not exclusively so. The number of Jews who identify as Black, Indigenous, Asian, or other peoples of culture actually ranges from 8 to 20% of the American Jewish population, and that number is just growing. So tonight's panel will engage some of the questions that arise around how and why museums really must help make change in the communities that we serve and our country more broadly. Of course, we are not going to resolve the questions tonight, but I think that exploring them will provide some important food for thought and maybe even some next steps for all of us who really love and support museums and also seek to improve the world around us. With that, I would like to introduce your moderator for the panel tonight. Tracy Guy Decker is the Deputy Director at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. She started at the museum in April 2015, right at the same time that Baltimore got national attention because of Freddie Gray's murder and the uprising that followed. And that timing really resulted in Tracy pushing herself and the JMM to learn and unlearn and grow in anti-racism and anti-oppression. In her 5 years at the museum, she's overseen projects and process management in every aspect of operations, from finance to exhibits and facilities and fundraising. And before she joined JMM, Tracy spent 15 years helping nonprofits and colleges and universities expand their impact and visibility through strategic marketing and fundraising. She has a master's degree in religious studies from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. Tracy, take it away.
Thanks so much, Kara. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you for framing our task so beautifully. As Kara noted, my name is Tracy Guy Decker. I am the Deputy Director at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And instead of introducing our panelists to you tonight, I'm actually going to let them introduce themselves. So panelists, if you could please share your name and your pronouns, your organization, if applicable, and a brief explanation of either what your organization does or what brings you to our panel today. And a reminder, we're going to go in the order of Damika, Marcia, Eric, and Yolanda. Damika.
Hi, my name is Danica Baker Wilson from the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. My title is the Director of Engagement and Strategic Initiatives. And the Lewis Museum's full title is the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture. And as the name of the museum would imply, that is the community whose story we tell. And so our focus is on the contributions of Black people in Maryland over the 400 years that we've been in this state. So I'm happy to be here, and as always, happy to be a part of anything that the Jewish Museum does. So thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marcia Semmel. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Currently, I'm the principal of my own consulting firm, but I've worked in the museum field since 1975, both in different types of museums, including startup museums and ethnographic museums. And then interspersed with my museum work, I've worked at all of the three major federal cultural agencies: the Humanities Endowment, the Arts Endowment, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So I've looked and experienced many different types of museums and held different positions in museums. Now I mostly consult on leadership, strategic planning, and partnerships. And I'm a longtime board member on the Council of American Jewish Museums. It's great to be here.
Good evening, I'm Eric Yellen. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I'm here representing the Capital Jewish Museum, for which I'm a consulting scholar and curator. And I'm also an associate professor of history at the University of Richmond. And it's sort of fitting that I'm coming after Marcia because I'm on the opposite spectrum of museum experience. I came to the Capital Jewish Museum because I wrote a book about African-American civil servants in Washington, and got involved early in the project many years ago, and have just fallen in love with the museum's purpose and vision and mission, and kind of stuck around long enough to be here at this critical moment for the museum.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yolanda Savage Narva. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm probably the only person that's not directly linked to a museum. I'm currently the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Operation Understanding DC. And OUDC is a local nonprofit that works to build intercultural communities here in the DMV. And we work with young people, and that focus is to help them understand the connections between history and culture and what's happening today, as well as giving them the tools and techniques they need to fight racism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. And in our work through workshops and trainings and taking our students to the Deep South and New York, museums are a huge part of what we do and how we actually educate and train our students. And so I'm very passionate about museums, and I'm really happy to be a part of this panel tonight.
Thank you all. I'm going to start with Danica. Danica, many of us who follow the museum field were really delighted and perhaps surprised when the National Museum of African American History and Culture first opened in DC, and the dwell times, that is the time that visitors spend on average in the museum, proved to be double that of other museums. And I'm guessing that was not surprising to you and your colleagues at the Lewis or other Black or African heritage museums. Can you talk a little bit about what role museums like yours play for their constituents? The Lewis is more than a site of informal education, isn't it?
Yeah, so for me, and I think for the entire education staff at the Lewis, and probably at all the other Black African heritage museums, we look at it not as education, but as engagement. And so when people go to the National Museum and spend 4 hours of their time, they're not just being educated, they're engaging all of their senses. They're sharing their stories, they're sharing their experiences. And so museums like ours and like the National Museum, they offer safe spaces for people that look like me to see themselves reflected on the walls and in leadership. And that's not what has often been the case for our community. And for the non-Black constituents of these museums, it's an opportunity to see or to experience and to hear and to feel and to see stories of this country, of people of this country that you haven't been exposed to. We all know, not maybe the specific statistics related to it, but we're all aware that slavery isn't properly taught in public schools. So when that is really your basis of education about Black people in America, your next stop, are museums like ours. And often those museums aren't readily available. They're not funded heavily. So there are all these limitations in the way. So there is a lot of time that takes place between kind of birth and people learning about the Black experience in America. So, for me, I didn't step foot into a Black museum until the Lewis Museum opened in 2005. I was 20. So that's unfortunate. And so now we're at a moment in history where everyone is seemingly interested in the story of Black people in America and Black people in the world. And so it's a really important opportunity for us to really properly engage everyone in conversation, to take an active role in fighting against racial injustice. It's just a really pivotal moment for institutions like ours to kind of step up in this role and in this moment. So it's definitely more than informal education. It's more than K through 12 education. It's more than student tours. It's conversations. It's discourse. It's respectful and healthy discourse. And so it is an amazing time, and I think it's a time of transition where, quite honestly, we don't know what direction everything will go in, but it's the spotlight is on a lot of museums like us, and so I think it's our responsibility to kind of take the reins and do what we have to do to really show the effectiveness of organizations like ours.
Thank you. Yeah. Building on that, Marcia, I'm going to turn to you. As you mentioned, you've had a long career in the field, including many years at each of the three of the federal agencies that are tasked with supporting the nation's cultural institutions. And so in short, you have had a higher level view of the museum field than those of us like me and Damika who spend our days living and breathing the offerings of one institution. And I'll share with our listeners that as we were planning for tonight's event, you and I bonded over our shared admiration of a quote from the current Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch III, who was also the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And Lonnie Bunch said, quote, "Museums may not be community centers, but they can be centers of their community," end quote. And so I was hoping, Marcia, that you could talk to us about what that means. What are you seeing in the field? How are museums like Damika's, like ours in the Capitol, how are we trying, resisting, achieving, or failing to be centers for our communities? And maybe even more importantly, how does the goal of being a center for our community affect what we do and how we operate?
Well, thanks a lot, Tracy. In another conversation that Secretary Bunch had that I happened to see, he reminded all of us that this is not a new idea, this idea of museums and community. In fact, I think Lonnie Bunch and I both have a high reverence for John Cotton Dana, who was the first director of the Newark Museum and who said 100 years ago, a museum is only as good insofar as it is of use. And by that, he meant that a museum has a responsibility in its public service mission to engage in a continuous conversation with its community and to keep growing and changing, now based on its mission, but to stay in touch with its community, to stay in touch with and responsive to the issues that are prevalent in any community, to know something about all of the populations in the community, and to be able to think about, just as Damika said, what are the stories that may not have been known that museums have a responsibility to tell? And what are the ways in which museums can be centers for conversations, debate, and discussion, really banking on and using their role as trusted institutions. So I think this applies now more than ever. It applies to all kinds of museums, whether you're a culturally specific museum or the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You have to be thinking not only about the stories that you're telling, the collections that you are displaying, what you still need to collect to fill in the gaps, and what positions that you are investing in that will allow you to fully occupy your space as an institution that has a responsibility to turn outward and to make a difference in the lives of the people in the community, well beyond the old and traditional notion of simply preserving and displaying objects. I think those days really are behind us. That is not the role that museums need to play, especially in a world where we all have a responsibility to serve as, this is very important to me, as institutions that embody our best democratic principles.
Yeah, thank you. With that, I'm going to turn to Eric. Kara mentioned in her intro about the exciting moment that the Capital Jewish Museum is right in the middle of. And so I want to say, well, first of all, I want to say Mazel Tov. It's really exciting.
Get in there.
And then I want to move to asking, as you and the staff envision the new iteration of CJM, how does what we've been talking about tonight inform your plans? What are you doing to make the CJM a center for community, or that outward facing, taking on that responsibility that Marcia just spoke to? And how will you know if you've succeeded?
Yeah, that last one's really tough. How will you know? Thanks. I think it's helpful to realize that the CJM comes out of what was originally the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington. And the Historical Society has a slightly different mission and kind of route than a museum, right? A historical society really is a collector of stories. And a museum has this weight that Marcia was talking about of community responsibility, and that Ani Bunch mentioned. And I think there are a couple of ways we're aiming to do this. One is to be a place for community by making community matter in the stories we tell, right? We talk a lot in the group about this is not going to be a Hall of Fame, right? It's not going to be a bunch of names and people that can speak to accomplishments, but rather people who lived within a community, right? And connected to other communities. So we certainly hope and plan to tell stories of Jewish Washingtonians, and we want members of that community to see themselves in it. But we're also intentionally working to put Jewish stories in a broader context, emphasizing intersections with other DC communities and interactions and intersections that are both positive and not so positive, right? Moments in which the community struggled to live up to its own values, moments in which community members called out other community members, right? The story of living in a kind of broader ecosystem of communities and recognizing that society means people influence each other, right? And that telling one group's stories just can't simply be told in the exclusion of another group's. So we tell stories of neighbors and neighborhoods, civic action, right? Of people wanting to be seen and do something for their own communities and for others, but also power and privilege and marginalization and assimilation, recognition of the way it's, we're telling a story of a primarily white community in a city that has, whose population today and whose culture is powerfully informed by African-American experience. But I think this also goes beyond sort of preaching and didactic panels. And so I think the second way is really about the kind of posture we imagine for the visitor. Our hope is that the museum becomes a place for community because it's a place where people are active. Our programming will invite dialogue, even difficult dialogue, around difficult issues. And in the museum exhibits, visitors are asked to, and Kara mentioned this, to connect, reflect, and act. And I'll take a minute to just sort of say what we mean by that, because they really are about the posture of the visitor. When we say connect, we mean can certainly connect with the stories we tell, but also to connect with other visitors. Several exhibits encourage dialogue among visitors, strangers and friends. Several of them require another person to work, right? So you have to really get deep into the material, you're gonna have to grab a friend or grab a stranger and sit down and work on something together. And then reflect means to base much of our work around questions, right? So that we ask questions that help the visitor consider the meaning of what they're seeing. And this is where, being a college professor, I felt like at home, right? That my job is to try to get people who think that they're in a passive experience, right? People who come to lectures, to get them to realize that it's not a passive experience to learn, right? That they have to ask questions and then kind of mull and not merely swallow the information whole cloth. And then finally, we have an emphasis on action. We provide stories of people who were acting to make their community better, and provide examples and tools for visitors to act in their own communities. So a whole section in the core gallery posits that DC is a city in which democratic participation is a lived value. And what did that actually mean for this community? And then how did that lead to connections with other communities? And where did people succeed and where did they fail? And what can we learn from the kinds of efforts of civic engagement and democratic participation of the past? So with Connect, Reflect, and Act, I think visitors not only learn about community, our hope is that they're making community with the people that they arrive with and with people they didn't arrive with, who they're sort of standing next to. I think it's a lot harder to know how we'll succeed, but my vision of it, or the museum's vision, I think is one that certainly that those who consider themselves to be Jewish Washingtonians will see themselves in the museum. I think that's important to the community as a start. I also hope they'll learn something new about themselves. And I think the real measure of success is whether people who don't consider themselves part of that community, one reason or another, either because they're not Jewish or because they're not from DC or they don't affiliate with whatever we're calling a Jewish Washingtonian, they feel welcome and they show up. Right? Are they there? When we look at the museum, are we seeing people who see a museum that's telling stories that are maybe different from their own, but speak to them in one way or another, and they come back?
Great, thank you. I love that idea of the posture of the visitor. I remember a consultant once asked my team, we were at an exhibit, and the consultant said, but what is the visitor doing at this point? And it was such an important question, and I think that's exactly what you're speaking to. Yolanda, I'm going to turn to you. So you're an educator, you work with young people to create intergroup understanding, relationship, empathy, and so I think maybe it's easy for those of us joining us today to kind of imagine how your work could be a catalyst for change. But in your introduction, you talked about using museums to help do what you do. And so I'd really like to hear you talk about the role that museums do play, and even the role that you think maybe they could play in helping usher in change that maybe we're not quite there yet.
So we are in such a unique time in our history. And we're in a national reckoning around racial justice and inequity. Juxtapose COVID-19 and the health inequities that have been unearthed during this time. And these are the issues that our students have the opportunity, unfortunately, to see in real time. The learning opportunities around connecting them with museums around the country has been tremendous for us, particularly because Operation Understanding DC is a program that is really foundationally grounded in building bridges. And so those bridges are usually built in person. So all of our programming has moved to an online platform since March of this year. And so while that has given us, tremendous opportunity to pivot and do some things differently, it has also challenged us as well. It has challenged our model of education and training for our students. And so during this point in time, we had to really rethink and reimagine how we deliver our programmatic offerings to our students. And honestly, we relied heavily on the opportunity link our students to online exhibitions around some of the issues that we focused on. And so because there's so much information, there's such a wealth of knowledge that has been done by museums, we use that as the catalyst for our conversations and how we engage our students. And Eric mentioned this before. We don't go in and prescribe what we want them to get from, say, something online, an exhibition online. We ask questions. We really want them to think creative in how they have experienced what they've experienced when they enter an online site, and how they interpret what they've learned. And that has been incredibly powerful for our students. I think when we think about what we could do, what museums could be, I think it's really important for students and people around our country to be able to see themselves in a museum, even if this museum is not specifically focused on their culture or their heritage. They need to be able to walk into any museum, and if their community is part of that museum's community, they should be able to walk in and hear and learn about their community and be connected in that way. And I think that's going to be really powerful as we move forward, because the story of racial equity and racial justice is the story of this country. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity right now to make sure that that is part of the story that we're telling. That is part of the American story. That's not separate from where we are today.
Thank you. Yeah, at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, we often say that our job is not to connect people to history, but to connect people to people through history. And that speaks to what you're saying. Also, I'm going to stay with you, Yolanda, because this moment and racial justice being a part of the American story, or working toward it. As we all have mentioned, this is a remarkable moment. Part of the remarkable moment is the national reckoning with racism. And many museums and nonprofits and even businesses issued statements about racial justice, especially in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And I'm starting with you, but I'll open it up to other panelists, is what do we need to do to ensure that those statements that we were also carefully crafting are not empty performances? How do we hold ourselves and others accountable for living up to them?
This is a conversation that I think people are having all over this country, maybe globally. And there are three things that come to mind for me. I think number one is that we understand that we're all entering these discussions at a different place, and making a statement is profound and it's powerful, but it's a first step. The thing that we have to recognize is that this isn't something that we can just check off and move to the next thing. This is part of our history. This is part of what we are all called to be responsible for. This is actually a fight for humanity and connection. And I think I'm hopeful that this time we are really processing and understanding that this is the long haul. This isn't a sprint to the finish line and we're done. We have to make sure that we develop the stamina and be able to persevere, and make sure that this is something that is a part of our conversations and a part of how we're thinking about the world. There's also this concept that I use when I'm talking to the students about mirrors and windows. And so I think with understanding our role in making sure we're making the world a better place, and we're dismantling systems of oppression, there's a window that we look out of. And that window is kind of the external facing piece, what we do collectively, what we do to make things better externally. And then there's the mirror piece, and that's us holding the mirror up to ourselves and saying, what role do I play in this system of oppression? How do I dismantle that individually and collectively? And we have to be able to play both roles to really actually make a difference and make sure we're just not making statements, but we're actually putting, ourselves on the line and being actionable towards dismantling systems of oppression.
I love that metaphor, the windows and mirrors.
Tracy-
Mark, do you want to answer?
Tracy, may I add to that? Because just this past week, the Cultural Competence Learning Institute, which is a museum-based organization, published a survey of the National Landscape Study of DEAI practices in museums, and almost 600 museums were surveyed.
Can you just define DEAI for our listeners?
Yes, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. And those are actually defined in this study, so you really know how this was defined for museums. But Yolanda just hit the main points of the survey when even though many museums have said those practices, those diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility practices, they've made a statement about it, or they say it's a priority. Most have not built it into the core work of their organization. They may have done a program or two. But they don't really see it as integral to, a kind of marathon, not a sprint, just as Yolanda said. And to the point that Yolanda made about the mirror and the window, the survey conclusions are many more museums need to look inside just as they look outside, and that they're really very slow to do that. And I was struck by the very small number of museums that have done any surveys at all of non-visitors. So they may know something about who comes, but over 65% of the respondents had never really looked at the full demographics of their community. And as Damika has talked about it, and as Kara said at the beginning of the session, we have huge diversity within the Jewish community, within the African American community, and of course within our larger communities. So I can write in the link to this survey for those of you who are more inside baseball.
It looks like it's been added to the chat.
Okay. Oh, it already has. This is magic. Thank you.
Yep. It's magic.
I wanted
Damika,
to say something really
please.
quick. Yes, sorry. Just to piggyback off of what Marsha and Yolanda and Eric, everyone said, I do think that specifically for museums where our measures of success have traditionally been what? How many people come to your programs? How many people come through your doors, right? So when COVID took that away from us, then, the big question is, how do you then measure your success? So with these statements, I do think that these statements will serve as the measures of success. I think that we are now in a moment where people are having no problem with holding others accountable. I'm watching what's happening at SF MoMA and at the Guggenheim and at the Walters. Like, people have no problem with calling out authority when they think something's not right. So, I think that we have personal charges and I think we have professional charges to hold each other and ourselves accountable. And like for me personally, I live on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I live in Talbot County. I live in Easton, and I live like 10 minutes from the Confederate Monument on the lawn of the courthouse. And so when the statements went out, I literally put in my calendar, in 6 months, I'm going to email this museum, I'm going to email this organization to see what they've done about what are they doing? Because I live here, pay my taxes here, my kid goes to school here, so I feel like I have a personal responsibility to hold others accountable. And I feel like personal charges lead to professional charges. And I think that all of us have a responsibility to do things like that. You may not want to be as bold as I am going to be, but maybe your charge is to talk to someone who works at the organization or talk to a constituent or something. But I do think that we all have personal responsibilities to hold our communities accountable for making a statement or not making a statement, because there are plenty who have not said anything.
Yeah, I'll just add, Tracy, that I think in the stories we tell also as museums, we can encourage that kind of accountability by reminding visitors that progress is not a given, right? That what feels like progress in the moment can be swept away, and there's so many examples, certainly in American history, of moving backward, right? Of loss. And so when we tell those stories, and when we have the opportunity as museums to tell longer stories, and we can tell the stories in which people had to work really hard, right, to not only move forward but maintain progress, right? Then we can remind visitors that just because someone spoke up now doesn't mean that tomorrow will be better, right? I always remind my students that you can see Martin Luther King Jr. in an Apple ad, but in 1963 or 1965, he was one of the most hated Americans alive, right? And so this assumption that we know heroism when we see it, and progress is inevitable is something museums can really puncture and do a service to their communities.
I think that's what a great point. Thank you so much, all of you. Tamika, I love the idea of putting a reminder in my calendar to follow up. I think that is just brilliant. Let's use the technology that we have to help us, hold ourselves accountable for holding people accountable. It's really brilliant. So I think the last question I had that I was going to ask you all, I feel like we've kind of dug into with our conversation. What I wanted to ask about was sort of, well, I'll just read it. Museums are often seen as elite institutions, and that perceived elitism has affected, to varying degrees, our hiring practices, our board leadership, and our interpretive spaces. And many museums are rethinking the stories they tell and the objects they collect, exactly what Eric was talking about doing. I think we also need to simultaneously support diversifying exhibitions and our field. And so thinking about that greater diversity at every level, it feels a little overwhelming, from the objects to the exhibitions, to the visitors, to the members, to the volunteers, to the board, to the staff. It's a lot. Where do we start? Where do we start with the work if we can only select one or two to focus on at a time? Marcia, you are the elder of the field right now in this panel, so I'm going to throw that to you, but the rest of you should feel free to jump in, and then this will be those of you listening, if you speak to Q&A, and I will be gathering them. Marcia.
Yeah, I guess I just, again, both what my colleagues on the panel said, I think was really important. I think for me, the most important thing is this is about trust and commitment. So this issue of accountability. So I'm not going to say you should start with one thing or the other. You have to look, of course, at not only who you are, deep individually at who you are and your values, but then who is on your staff? What are your job descriptions? Who is on your board? So there's a lot of internal looking, much as you have to have sensitivity to those people in your community who you want to reach. But as you build the trust, it's really easy to lose it. So that sense of authenticity, of vulnerability, of understanding that you don't have all the answers. I loved what everybody's been saying about questions. I think those are the key that the people in your community will either see through if you're not being authentic and call you on it, because nobody's being shy these days, or will cut you some slack if they see that you're slow, steady, but you're committed and you're not going to turn back.
And I would add to that, and something Eric said again that really resonates with me is that sometimes movement may not necessarily equal progress, right? I mean, I think that we're at a place where we have to try to make a change, and we have to be prepared that we may fail but we start again. We start again at our beginnings, and we keep doing it, and we keep doing it because, even beyond this being a marathon, this is life's work. And I think people are at a place where they are, number one, holding people accountable, but number two, also not being judgmental if they see that you're making an effort to try and integrate racial justice and equity, within your practices, within your HR systems, within your board governance, and that this is an incremental process. But I do really hold people to this level of accountability where I would like to see them try. I would like to see them attempt to make the changes that we so desperately need, and understanding that sometimes you may fail, and the moral arc of the universe is long, but it tends to bend toward justice. And so I think that's where we are.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's so important to listen. This notion that museums have all the answers is ridiculous. So, I mean, just being in that posture of listening, and we've all talked about questions. I think that that's incredibly important.
From a perspective inside of the museum, I think that the best way to avoid like the Gucci sweater moment for everybody is to make sure that the proper stakeholders are at the table. It's pretending, like Marsha said, pretending like we have all the answers when right up the block is the Jewish Museum, down the street is, like the aquarium or whatever. So whoever these kind of stakeholders, no matter how remote, bringing them to the table, not at the end for approval, but in the planning process to make sure that you get it right along the way. And I think trying to tell stories for other people and not including them in your process is often the culprit when we do get it wrong. And it's as simple as saying, I don't have all the answers. Can you help me? Like, how hard is that? Tracy, we partner all the time because we know alone we don't have all the answers. So I think just adopting that attitude, not only externally with your cultural partners, but internally with your own practices. I think that's, like Marsha said, there's no magic bullet. There's no perfect place to start. But I think starting there and just kind of realizing that the more diverse, the better. Diversity in thought, diversity in experience, perspective. It's not going to do anything but enrich the entire project and process.
Thank you. I'm seeing some questions from our audience. I want to remind the folks watching on Facebook that if you enter your questions into the chat on Facebook, that we do have people monitoring who will get those questions to me. So feel free to do that. And if you have a question, if you could please put it into Q&A. So I see actually from my boss asking me to speak to JMM to be an agent of change. So I would just quickly say that we take a lot of what the folks have said here about stakeholders. So we are in the very early stages of what the Capital Jewish Museum is doing now in terms of expanding our physical footprint. And so we had a whole bunch of stakeholder meetings, including one where we invited Jews of color of the Baltimore community to come to talk about what they would need from a Jewish community. We partnered with Damika and her colleagues for what ended up being a Born Digital exhibit about in the aftermath, the 5-year anniversary of Freddie Gray and the uprising, which was originally supposed to be a real one, but digital is real, an in-person exhibit, but then ended up being Born Digital because of COVID. And we do what we can to work with Damika and her colleagues and to make sure that the Jews of Maryland who don't look like me, an Ashkenazi European heritage Jew, are welcome and featured there. I'm also seeing Marsha, one of our listeners today is curious to hear more about CAJM, the Council of American Jewish Museums. So if you could briefly tell us about what CAJM is and what its sort of mission is.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. So the Council of American Jewish Museums is the professional organization for institutions, Jewish museums, and actually we have an international membership, and for those professionals who work in Jewish museums. And CAJM, as it has evolved, not only do we sort of share news of what's going on in museums, but we've been doing a lot of work, especially around racism and anti-Semitism. So there have been 2 national symposia talking about tolerance and museums in responding to acts of hate, not only for protecting visitors to our respective museums and making our museums safe places, but also talking about programs and resources. So actually the latest grant is really to develop a whole school curriculum based on the work of these 2 symposia. There's also been a lot of work done with, in the face of the COVID pandemic, working with some artists to create outdoor works of art, originally commissioned works of art that are going to commemorate the Harvest Festival of Sukkot. And this year, for the first time, instead of just an annual meeting that is mostly focused on Jewish museums in this hemisphere, we're joining forces with the European and really global community of museums to talk about some of these issues. So we provide professional training, and we provide a place for communication and resources and projects that no one museum could do on its own. There's also a wonderful collecting initiative among many museums around COVID-related stories.
Yeah, I'll just say the JMM is collecting. Eric, are you all as well?
Absolutely, yes. We've got stuff, masks people are making, and signs from protests, and there's a call out for all kinds. We're collecting for everything right now.
Yeah.
In part because we realize that there are stories still left to be told, right? That we haven't tried to tell before, and then new ones like COVID that you can't expect.
Right. Tamika?
I think that's been great to see. I was going to say that's been great to see from museums collecting the moment. I think sometimes we forget the moment. I will say at the Lewis, I wasn't there 5 years ago, but with Freddie Gray, we didn't collect the moment, right? So 5 years later, we didn't really have any material culture collected to really reflect what happened at that time. And so we learned our lesson. And so immediately I was obviously out there protesting, collecting signs. And there's actually an exhibition that we started planning June 1 that's opening next month, right before the election, called Make Good Trouble, that really that reflects this summer of protest that's happened around the world, really. So that's been really great to see everyone kind of collectively collecting.
Yeah. It's an important reminder of what it is that we do. I think so often the public thinks of museums as like stuff in the past, that belongs in a museum can almost be an insult. And so I love to see us as a field really, really live up to our charge. So that's really great. So I have one other question open in the Q&A. And if you all are listening and have burning questions, please share them. We're getting close to winding down, but we have a few more minutes. And this question is maybe partially answered, Marcia, by what we were talking about CAJM's work internationally. Adam Sherry wants to know if there are any countries whose patterns of museums acting as agents of change could serve as models for those of us here in the States. I do not know the answer to that question. So I'm just gonna open it up if any of you have insight to share.
I don't know that there's sort of a countrywide answer to that, but there are museums all over the world that I think who are dealing with really important social issues in very powerful ways. And I'm not going to remember the names of all of them. There's a museum in Liverpool that I think deals with human rights and has dealt with the slave trade. There are museums. One of the most powerful museums I've visited in the last 2 years is actually in Montgomery, Alabama, the Legacy Museum, in conjunction with the Peace and Justice Memorial. That was created because Brian Stevenson felt that a museum inspired by museums in Berlin and South Africa, and that museums were the place to tell stories that are powerful and life-changing. But I can't think of a country that specializes in those kinds of museums.
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, in Germany, there have been some really remarkable examples of museums reckoning, right, with Germany's own history, and you know, the Nuremberg Museum is this remarkable museum about not we have to tell, and we do tell, and we need to keep telling the stories of World War II and of the Holocaust. That museum tells the story of the rise of Nazism and the sort of pre-story, right? And what's harrowing about it is the reckoning with how ordinary, right, the rise of this particular political party was, and how it moved into German society and through German society, and that is it will stick with me forever. And then I would also say that if you have not traveled outside of the United States and seen museums, go to a place where they are dealing with their own history of inequality. A place like Jamaica, you cannot go to a museum or walk in any cultural area of Jamaica and not deal with slavery, right? And enslavement. And when you, it's a remarkable contrast to the United States, right? Where there's equal histories of millions of enslaved stories, right? Of people of enslavement, and you can't walk around in Jamaica without it. And in the United States, you can go a very long time without reckoning with that, right? And so there are, I think there are examples of countries having to deal with and openly dealing with their histories, both as difficulties imposed from within and from without.
Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to tackle that one? No. So I don't see any more questions at the moment, and we're getting close to time, so maybe that is my sign that it's time to wrap up. But I want to thank each of you for joining us this evening. This has been really fascinating and exciting to have all of us talking about these tough questions that the whole country, the whole world is reckoning with, and museums in their own way. And I'm just going to sort of close by saying, we talked a lot about keeping each other accountable and sort of slow incremental work. You know, Yolanda talked about, I want to see people are trying. And I just want to name the fact that our culture prizes perfectionism, and perfectionism in this conversation, especially for those of us who have white privilege, will keep us quiet. And we should fight back against that perfectionism, because our silence and lack of action is in fact an endorsement for continued oppression. So I just want to say that out loud. Or whether we're talking about as a museum professional or our work as a mom or whatever it is, don't let perfectionism be the enemy of standing up. So I'm going to leave us with that. Thank you all so much for being a part of this panel. For those of you who I can't see, who are in our audience, thank you so much for giving up a part of your Wednesday evening to talk about museums as agents of change. It has been really a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. And for those of you who celebrate, Lashana Tova, a good, sweet new year in 5781. Thank you.